This is the lymphatic system. It's a short chapter, but it serves as a good introduction to the immune system and some of the structures and cells we'll be seeing in the immune system. Now, the lymphatic system is made up of lymphatic vessels, lymph, which is the fluid inside those vessels, and then lymph nodes, which are designed to cleanse the lymph. We do have lymphoid organs and tissues, but they are not connected to the system. So they'll house things like macrophages and other types of lymphocytes. And these organs include things like the spleen, thymus, tonsils, and we'll talk about some of those in this chapter. But again, they're not connected to the lymphatic system as far as the actual vessels. The only thing connected to the vessels are the lymph nodes and then having the lymph inside. So what is lymph? Well, essentially, the plasma leaks out of the blood capillaries into the interstitial space, and that interstitial fluid gets picked up by lymphatic capillaries. And once that interstitial fluid gets into the lymphatic capillaries, it's called lymph. And we filter about 3 liters of plasma per day through the lymphatic system. And so again, this movement goes from blood capillaries leaking out plasma into the interstitial space, now called interstitial fluid, lymph capillaries picking up that interstitial fluid, entering into the lymph capillaries through these little mini valves I'll show you on the next slide, and now it's called lymph. So here in the upper right, you can see the green lymph capillaries, the blue and red blood capillaries. You can also see the close-up of the mini valves, which is the little entrance points of the lymphatic capillaries. And what happens is lymph goes in, and those valves prevent the lymph from leaking back out. It's important to understand that the lymph system is a one-way street. It's a one-way system, and lymph always flows towards the heart. It's not like the circulatory system that has arteries that go away from the heart and veins that go towards the heart, right? So that's like a two-way street. This is wherever the lymph vessels are, they merge and merge and merge, right? They anastomose, and then they dump into 2 ducts that are going to dump back into the bloodstream. Now, if you remember from the blood vessel chapter, we talked about different types of capillaries, and the lymphatic capillaries are very leaky capillaries, so they're very permeable, and it makes sense because we want to pick up different things from the plasma like proteins and debris and pathogens, cancer cells, things like that, because we're going to cleanse it as we move through the lymph system. I've already mentioned the mini valves that allow for one-way movement because they shut off any leakage of the lymph out of those lymphatic vessels. And so that's a good way to, they're leaky so we can easily get fluid in, but again have valves to prevent fluid from easily leaking back out. Lymph is found in most areas except for it's absent in bones, teeth, bone marrow, and the central nervous system, although there's some research showing that there's some lymphatics in the nervous system. Lacteals, these are specialized lymphatic capillaries we're going to talk about in the digestive system that are necessary to absorb some of the longer chain fatty acids. Now, lymphatic vessels have the same 3 tunics or layers as veins, which means they have the same 3 as arteries because veins and arteries have the same 3 tunics, right? We have the tunica intima, the tunica media, and then the tunica externa. Now, some comparisons between veins and lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels have thinner walls than veins, just like veins have thinner walls than arteries. The lymphatic vessels have valves like veins do, but they have more valves than veins. And veins, it's a convergent system, right? So they're going to anastomose or merge. The lymphatic vessels actually anastomose even more frequently. Now, what we see on this picture is the drainage system, right? How it works. If you look at the green that I outlined in red there, that drains into what's called the right lymphatic duct. And the right lymphatic duct is going to dump into the juncture point of the right subclavian vein and right internal jugular vein, okay? On the left side, you can see, well, actually the left and the bottom. So basically the abdomen all the way down and the entire left side, that is going to drain into what's called the thoracic duct, which drains into the juncture point of the left internal jugular vein and left subclavian vein, okay? and I'll show you a close-up picture of that in just a second. Also, the lower extremity drains into what that right there that I have circled in red, the cisterna chyli, and that actually becomes the thoracic duct, or kind of drains into the thoracic duct. So this slide just talks about what I said. The right side drains the upper side of the right arm, head, neck, and thorax, and that goes into the right lymphatic duct, into the bloodstream. The thoracic duct arises from the cisterna chyli that drains the entire lower extremity, and then drains the remainder of that left side as well, and goes back into the bloodstream. And again, the juncture points are going to be the internal jugular veins and subclavian veins. That's where these two ducts go into on either side. There's no such thing as a left lymphatic duct. So the right drains that right upper portion, and the thoracic duct drains the left and the entire lower extremity. Here's a close-up that shows you the cisterna chyli and draining into the thoracic duct, and then of course the better picture of the entrance points of both the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. So how do we move lymph through the lymphatic vessels? Well, very similar to how we move blood through veins. We're going to milk the lymph forward. We're going to use things very similar to veins. So the muscular pump, as the skeletal muscles contract, they compress the lymphatic vessels, and because we have valves in those vessels, it pushes the blood unidirectionally forward. Respiratory pump, same thing. As we breathe, we compress the lymphatic vessels and we move and milk the lymph forward towards the heart. Pulsations of nearby arteries. This one's different. So the walls of the lymphatic vessels are so thin, when there's a large artery close by, the pulsation, something like maybe an abdominal aorta, the pulsations of that compress the wall of the lymph vessel. And anytime we compress the wall of the vessel, because there's valves, it's going to push the fluid forward. And then lastly, we had the same three tunics, so that means there's a tunica media. So contractions of smooth muscle, which is the tunica media layer, pushes, they contract rhythmically in this peristaltic type movement to move lymph, again, directly towards those thoracic duct or right lymphatic duct back into the bloodstream. And then at the bottom, we talk about these valves that prevent backflow. Remember, the valves are necessary for the respiratory pump and the muscular pump and even those pulsations to even work, because if we compress the vessel, normally the fluid will go both ways, right? But if there's valves, then the fluid only moves unidirectionally. Some cells that we're going to see in the lymphatic system are lymphocytes, B and T cells. We'll talk a little bit more about these on the next slide, and then a lot more in the immune system chapter. The T cells, called T lymphocytes, are going to attack virus-infected cells, cancer cells, and we'll talk about more specifics later, but right now cancer cells and viral infected cells are going to be the two key things, as well as some other things we'll talk about in the immune system chapter. The B cells, they're going to differentiate into plasma cells once they're activated, and the plasma cells are going to secrete antibodies. Again, we'll talk a lot more about these cells, their function, their process of maturity and activation in the immune system chapter. So lymph nodes, what do they do? Well, we already mentioned that they're going to filter the lymph. Well, they are going to filter because they contain macrophages that are going to phagocytize a number of microorganisms, debris, and things of that nature. A second function of the lymph nodes, because they house these lymphocytes that need to be activated, it's going to be immune system activation. So the lymphocytes can get activated within the lymph node and then mount an attack against whatever that specific foreign antigen is. And we'll talk again more about that activation process. That's something that we'll talk about in the immune system. But we do house macrophages for filtering and lymphocytes for becoming active to fight off pathogens. Here with the picture of the lymph node, you can see the structure, and you see that the vessels going in, the afferent vessels, are more numerous than the vessels exiting, the efferent vessels. And this is specific for a reason, because what we want to happen is as the fluid comes into that lymph node, we want the fluid to somewhat stagnate and not move right out, because we want the macrophages that are in there to have time to do their job. We also want the cells that are in the lymph node to become activated. We want them exposed to either an antigen or an antigen-presenting cell, which again, that won't make a lot of sense just yet until we talk about it in the immune system chapter, but the activation process needs to take a little time as well. So we want to slow the fluid movement down. How do we do it? More tubes in, less tubes out, and then it drains slower, allowing those cells inside the lymph node to do their job. So this slide just talking about some of the stuff I've already mentioned, that the afferent vessels go in, the efferents exit, and that there's fewer efferents so that that fluid will stagnate for lymphocytes to become activated and macrophages to cleanse and phagocytize debris and pathogens and whatever else may need it. Now, only lymph nodes filter lymph. This is a really important point because we have lymph organs, right? These lymphoid organs, but they don't filter lymph. Why? Well, they're not connected to this system of tubes, right? These lymphatic vessels, as I mentioned before, it's lymphatic vessels with lymph in them, connected to lymph nodes, and that's it. So lymph nodes filter lymph, and you can kind of think of it like, there was a documentary that I watched where there was these sea turtles, and they would go down to this little area in the ocean, they called them cleaning stations. And when they went down to this little area, a bunch of little fish would eat all the gunk off of their shells. And the turtle would leave, and the next turtle would come, and the fish would eat the gunk off of that turtle's shell. And what you want to think of is, as the lymph moves into the lymph node, the macrophages act like the little fish, eating the gunk out of the lymph, right? And then we leave the lymph node, and we move into another lymph node, and then the macrophages in there eat some of the gunk that's in there. And so it's a cleansing process. So this is how we're filtering the lymph. So let's talk about some lymphoid organs. The spleen is the largest lymphoid organ, and it has numerous functions, two of which are similar to lymph nodes, except instead of filtering lymph, they're actually filtering blood in the same way. So we've got the number 2, you can see cleanses blood, so using macrophages to remove debris and dead red blood cells and pathogens, things like that. We also have that immune surveillance and response is the lymphocyte activation. They can become activated there as well, and even serve as a site of lymphocyte proliferation where the lymphocytes multiply, right, once they become activated. Number 3, a separate function, right, different than lymph nodes. It stores breakdown products of red blood cells, so things like iron, because we recycle iron. The only time you lose iron is when you lose blood. And we're also going to store platelets and monocytes here. And remember from our blood chapter, monocytes can differentiate into macrophages. And then last but not least, in the fetus, this can be a site for red blood cell, which are called erythrocytes, red blood cell production. We have 2 key areas in the spleen. We have white pulp and red pulp. And most of the white pulp is made up of lymphocytes. And the red pulp has red blood cells and macrophages. And even the macrophages there are designed to get rid of worn out red blood cells, pathogens, things like that. Now the thymus is a unique lymphoid organ. Most lymphoid organs pretty much do the same thing as the lymph nodes, which is that immune surveillance and response or activation, and then the cleansing. The spleen, of course, has the additional functions. The thymus has a completely different function. It neither filters nor activates the immune system. The function of the thymus is to cause maturation of T cells, or T lymphocytes. And so all the blood cells are born in the bone marrow, but the T cells are going to mature in the thymus. Now, the thymus is going to increase in size during childhood, and it stops growing sometime during adolescence and then gradually atrophies, which not like a muscle atrophies. It atrophies in a sense that it gets, the functional tissue gets replaced by fatty tissue. It's still functional throughout a lifetime, it should be. However, it doesn't function as much as in early childhood. There is a blood thymus barrier, and we said that the function of thymus is T cell or T lymphocyte maturation. That is the function. I've got that underlined there. But there is a blood thymus barrier. Why? Well, we're going to find out later that we don't want T cells that are anti-self, right, or not self-tolerant to escape, right? We have to make sure the T cells are mature, and that part of that maturation process is not only identifying the pathogen that they're built for, but it's being self-tolerant and not attacking self. So we have this blood thymus barrier that protects those self-reactive T cells from escaping. Another type of lymphoid tissue, we have what's called mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and those are things like tonsils in the respiratory system, Peyer's patches in the small intestines, and the appendix found connected to the large intestine. The tonsils, if we look at function, they're going to trap and destroy bacteria. They're going to allow immune cells to build memory for pathogens. So again, we're kind of getting an immune system activation and also this cleansing. So very similar to what we're seeing from other lymphoid and lymphatic tissue. What are the tonsils? We have palatine tonsils. When you say and you go to the back of the oropharynx, those on either side of the palatine tonsils. Under the tongue, we have the lingual tonsil, the pharyngeal tonsil, also called the adenoids, in the back of the nasopharynx. And then we also have tubal tonsils. Those surround the openings of the auditory tubes into the pharynx. Now, some other mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, the Peyer's patches and the appendix. Again, they're going to destroy bacteria, right? So for the Peyer's patches being the small intestines, they're protective of the small intestines. The appendix is protective of the large intestines, being attached to the cecum portion of the large intestine. And then they're also going to generate memory lymphocytes. And memory is going to make more sense in the next chapter because we'll talk about how we make memory cells that actually give us our immunity in case we get attacked by that pathogen or microorganism again. That wraps up the lymphatic system chapter. We will continue the next chapter in the immune system.